I gotta say, I was very critical of Donald Trump when he was president. He, at times, could get rather bellicose in his rhetoric towards other countries like North Korea and Iran. I was very critical of that. I did not think that, well, sometimes I did. But for the most part, I didn't think that Trump's goal was to start a war with Iran or North Korea. But nevertheless, I was not a fan of his brinksmanship strategy. I did not like. I was very critical on this channel when he was ramping up rhetoric with Iran and was engaging in a series of tit-for-tat provocations that culminated in the killing of General Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Quds Force, a very important military leader within Iran. I lambasted Trump for allowing John Bolton, not quite fair to call him neoconservative, but certainly super ultra aggressive hawk, to sabotage the first opportunity for peace talks, I guess you could call them, between the U.S. and North Korea. Trump had done, I thought, a lot of good to try and ingratiate himself with the North Koreans. I don't think that he lowered himself or anything like that. I thought that, he flattered the North Korean leader and got them to come and talk, and then he let John Bolton blow it all up. And that, of course, raised tensions. North Korea is a nuclear power. You always want to be lowering tensions with nuclear powers. But nothing that Trump did, which I heavily criticized back then, regarding Iran or North Korea. Iran isn't even a nuclear power. North Korea is. Amounts even close to how terrible what Joe Biden did today was. I know I'm speaking sort of in detached sentences here. I'm pausing at weird times, but that's really because I'm having trouble processing just how terrible what Biden said today was. And that, of course, if you read the title of the video, he basically threatened to launch World War III. He said an invasion of Taiwan would rope in the United States, and that would be, without using the words World War III, he said we're going to have World War III. He said that if a conflict were to break out between China and Taiwan, it would not remain limited to China and Taiwan. The U.S. military, he specifically said the U.S. military would intervene. And that would make it a world war. You've got North America intervening in the Pacific. And that, of course, would rope in other countries and would inevitably escalate into a nuclear conflict. That's World War III. And make no mistake, that's exactly what Joe Biden said. The White House, thankfully, is trying to backtrack and trying to say, no, that's not what he said. I'm not owned. I'm not owned. But they are owned. Joe Biden did say exactly that. And he, like it or not, is the figurehead of the current U.S. administration. And so what he says does matter. When the President of the United States, who is for all intents and purposes a dictator with respect to foreign policy, when he makes proclamations like this, you don't just sweep it under the rug. It is the most serious and dire of consequences, or of circumstances. It is equally serious as if the Chinese, I don't know what you call him, chairman of the Communist Party, or he likes to be called the president now. I think it's ridiculous to call the leader of China a president. What does the term president even mean? But call him what you will, Xi Jinping or whoever, the Chinese leader, if they were to make a threat like this and to say, if the United States intervenes or invades Cuba to overthrow the Castro regime, that the Chinese would intervene militarily. And you might say, that's ridiculous. The Chinese, where would their military come from? They have no military presence in the Mediterranean. That's true. But what if they did? What if the Chinese had military bases all throughout the mid-Atlantic? Or I guess it's more, I don't know if you call that mid-Atlantic, because it's pretty far south, I think. But anyway, what have you? The Atlantic and the Mediterranean, the Gulf of Mexico. What if the Chinese had bases scattered all throughout there, and the U.S. was talking about annexing Cuba, which would not at all be unprecedented. Americans have been talking about annexing Cuba, even though they're not really talking about it right now, but throughout American history, it's been a common theme, going all the way back to the founding, I believe. And so, like, let's say the U.S. decided to do that, and the Chinese said, if you do that, China will intervene militarily. You think anybody would stop short of saying the Chinese are threatening World War III? You think that anyone in the United States would say that it is, an exaggeration to claim that invading Cuba would lead to World War III? The answer is, of course not. And it would be reasonable for them to think that. In fact, it would be unreasonable for them not to think that. It would be pure cope for them to deny that. And so when the shoe's on the other foot, when you have the American president threatening to intervene, not diplomatically, not with words, but with the military. He used the term military. What's the military going to go over to Taiwan and do? Play board games with the Chinese military? Are they going to settle this with a good game of rock, paper, scissors? Or are they going to settle it with bombs and bullets? What we witnessed today is a senile old man threatening to destroy human civilization. That's what he's talking about. Because the Chinese have made it clear, just as the Russians had made it clear about Ukraine, Taiwan for them is an existential issue. They are obsessed with it. I think that their obsession is unhealthy. I think that it is absurd for them to, lay claim to a plot of land to an island that they have never controlled, which is not inhabited by their people. Yes, it is inhabited by Chinese people, but, like Hong Kong before it was colonized by Communist Party loyalists, you've got red Chinese and you've got normal Chinese. I've met a lot of Chinese folks in my life who are not communists. And so I think that it's ridiculous for the CCP, just on an intellectual level. I think I don't entertain, or I don't have much patience for the argument that non-communist Chinese people living outside of communist China are the property of the CCP, because that's how the CCP treats its people. They're cattle. They never truly atoned for the Great Leap Forward or any of their other atrocities. And so I have much less sympathy for their claim to Taiwan than I have for Russia's claim to certain parts of Ukraine. I think that the Russian government is eminently more just and reasonable when compared to the Chinese government. That doesn't mean that I'd like to live under either of them, but when you compare the two, it's a lot easier for me to say, you know what, I don't really care what the Ruskies do. It'll probably work out all right, especially when you look at how bad Ukraine is to begin with. But when it comes to China and Taiwan, to me, it's a pretty black and white issue. Taiwan, pretty decently run country. I think that the ROC government, as far as East Asian states go, they've done pretty all right. Maybe on par with Japan. CCP murdered, tens of millions of its own people, aborted however many, probably hundreds of millions, forcibly, over the past few decades. And so I say all this to, I guess, bolster my credentials as someone who is not a fan of them. I think I've established that. And with all that said, I still do not think that the United States should lift a finger to stop the Chinese from conquering the island formerly known as Formosa in the West. Folks, raise your hand if you're old enough to remember when maps would name Taiwan as Formosa, or at least had Formosa in parentheses. You never see that anymore. At the end of the day, even though my sympathies lie squarely with one side over the other, the consequences are too great. In fact, even if there wasn't a chance of this being a nuclear conflict, I would be opposed to this, because I don't think that Americans should die to, preserve a government which I find intellectually more appealing when it is faced with certain destruction at the hand of a less desirable government. And even if there was no chance of, risking American blood or treasure, which of course isn't possible. You always are risking that in a war. You're always going to lose soldiers. You're always going to lose money that you had to spend on all of this equipment that's lost and destroyed. But even if that weren't the case, I know that the United States has never intervened for humanitarian purposes. That's always the cover. There are plenty of examples in which, better governments were replaced, conquered, overthrown by terrible governments, and the U.S. never lifted a finger to help them. Well, why did the U.S. not help them? Well, because the U.S. Had no real financial or business or corrupt interests in those countries. It didn't matter to the United States regime, to its elites, what happened in these countries. And so the U.S. intervenes wherever its elites have an interest. And then they use their humanitarian and, intellectual superstructure as a cover to hide whatever corrupt interests they're serving. And so even if American blood and treasure were not at stake, I would still probably oppose the U.S. intervening in Taiwan, because I know that they would only be intervening so that the U.S. could rape and pillage the country rather than the communist Chinese. So there's no good outcome here. I think at this stage, the die's been cast. Taiwan's days are numbered. I would have liked to have visited the country before it was destroyed. And I say destroyed because, the communists are not known for preserving culture. Taiwan, I've always sort of thought of it as it's a slice of what China would look like without communism, without the Cultural Revolution, without without an effort, a sustained effort to try and destroy thousands of years of Chinese culture. I've always thought of Taiwan as a model for what all of China could be if the CCP were ever eliminated. But as a realist, I have to recognize that things do not always go my way. The problem that a lot of these neocons have is that they think, and the progressives the same way. Progressives and neocons not all that different in my view. They're both terrible in their own ways, in very similar ways, in fact. But they have this view of history. They have a theory of history, just like the Marxists, that, history itself is a kinetic force, and that history is pushing the world along. History is pushing these changes, and it's always moving, it's progressing. We're always progressing forward. And so to them, if they see, if these Western liberals see the CCP, these Western neocons see the CCP as a force of, the old, as a regressive force, they can't conceptualize the idea of the CCP expanding its power. They see, oh no, it's inevitable. We, Western liberalism, are on the ascent. We will continue to grow. We will continue to add states to the European Union. European integrationism will continue on its linear path until eventually there are no more European states. We all speak, Esperanto or something, and all laws are written by the Eurocrats. And the European Union and the United States will colonize the rest of the earth and determine what the political landscape in every other country will look like. And so if we, the West, will, for the current regime in Taiwan to remain in place, then so it shall. When in reality, a realist must understand that for the West to try and save Taiwan, it would most certainly have to sacrifice itself, and in the end, Taiwan would be destroyed anyway. So what's the damn point? The point, from the West perspective, from the neocon, neoliberal World Economic Forum perspective, is that they're morally right, and they have the moral high ground, and if they have to martyr, a few 100 million people on this planet to make their point, to signal their own virtue, then so be it. They'll be safe in their underground bunkers in Switzerland and New Zealand and Colorado, I think is where, well, actually, the President of the United States has bunkers all over this country. I think the most famous presidential bunker it's like at the Biltmore, or is it Bretton Woods? It's some big old-timey hotel out in the country, in the hills or the mountains in the Northeast. Now, getting back to the issue at hand, the words today that were spoken by the President of the United States, this cannot be written off as a gaffe. It's not a gaffe. It cannot be written off as just an off-the-cuff remark. This is not an example of the President not knowing what he's saying. He knew exactly what he was saying. It was reflecting the sentiment that is being expressed in elite circles behind closed doors in the United States. This is the way that the U.S. elites are thinking. It's just that there's enough common sense amongst them that they understand that if they say these things publicly at this point, they will accelerate the danger, they will escalate the situation and the conflict too quickly. So Joe Biden just said a little too much out loud, but he really didn't reveal more than we already knew. So I think it's hard to avoid at this point the conclusion that America's dependency on imports from China is going to be threatened. Our supply of goods is going to be threatened as this conflict ramps up between our two governments. And that, of course, will have the worst effect on us Americans. Yes, will it affect Chinese businesses? Sure, but these Chinese businesses will ultimately be able to find other customers. They might have less sales. They might have to sell their goods at a lower price. But at the end of the day, they will survive. They do still have their goods that they're producing. And that's not nothing. That's everything. We here in the United States have our green pieces of paper that we produce. That's all we produce is money. Think about all the people who are rich in this country. How do they get rich? Do they get rich by producing things? Do you hear of industrialists, factory owners, entrepreneurs who, made some impressive gadget? No, normally, even if you hear about an entrepreneur who invented something, it's like some little knick-knack. And it's usually made in China. Other than that, all the richest people in America made their money by just moving around money. They made money with money. They produce nothing of value. They are, as far as the global economy is concerned, they're not even redundant. They're just parasitic on net because the U.S. drains far more resources from the rest of the world than we send out. That, after all, is the nature of our exorbitant privilege, as it was called by Alan Greenspan. Our ability to run perpetual trade deficits because of our reserve currency status. When you run a trade deficit, that means that you receive more goods from the rest of the world than you produced and sold to the rest of the world and traded away to the rest of the world. So when you run a trade deficit for 40 years, there is no balance there. We're just stealing from the rest of the planet. 99.9% of Americans don't understand that. That has been the source of our prosperity since, the dawn of the Reagan administration. America, its productive capacity had been rotting away for some time, since the late 60s, early 70s, and throughout the 70s. And then things seemed to turn around in the Reagan years. That's the story. And then we've been on a 40-year bull run. But in reality, all we've been doing is having the rest of the planet subsidize our standards of living. And by taking on the golden goose, that is, of course, communist China, which, the dirty little secret is they're not that communist at all. They are authoritarian, perhaps even totalitarian, depending on what reports you read about them. But at the end of the day, when it comes to doing business, they're arguably far more capitalist than the United States. And so we've had this great gig where China sends us stuff and we send them green pieces of paper. Well, if we go picking a fight with them, we're going to lose that. And in the long run, I think that'll be a good thing. I don't think it's healthy the way we're living right now. But the people in charge, I don't know, maybe they do. Maybe that's why, this is considered a gaffe, what Biden said, and the White House is trying to walk it back. But I was going to say, they don't understand how lucky we are. They don't understand how weak of a position we're in. And how the last thing that is in the interest of preserving the status quo in the United States is picking a fight with China. And I say that as someone who does not want to preserve the status quo. I think that things have to get worse before they get better. So with that said, I will see folks back here tomorrow.